All right, well, let's get started. Glad you're here. Hope your week's been progressing well as we continue our study of words that matter. Just as a reminder, the premise of the class is that we're looking at words that have most often a very religious connotation. I think we throw those words around with the assumption we all know, we all have a common understanding and agreement upon what it means. And hopefully it's becoming clear that it's not that simple, that we have a lot of challenges, especially being 2,000 years worth of history, and words get in great part their meaning through a social construct, moment in time, context, and there's translation, that's another struggle. And so we're trying to look through these classes, look at certain words, and try to look kind of what's the setting of the word, what's the meaning of the word, and then hopefully draw it to its fulfillment in Jesus, and then talk about some practical applications as we move with the idea. We're in class, this is number 6, we're going to be talking about Yahweh, Lord Yahweh. So, a couple of things I want to start out with. One is, in Genesis chapter 1, it says there, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Well, and if you just put a pause right there, in English we have it translated capital G God, right? So we're like, obviously, we all know which God this is. Okay, the word actually used there is Elohim, which is the most generic word for spiritual being. Probably be a more accurate translation. And you could capitalize it because we eventually know where that's going. But in a world where there was gods for everything and everybody had a god, it starts out with the most generic word for it. And I think on purpose, because it wants to invite the ancient reader in to say, oh yeah, creation story. We have a creation story. Our people have a creation story. The Babylonians have a creation story. The Egyptians, the Canaanites, the Assyrians. What spiritual being are you referring to? And it kind of draws you in, and the story itself is making a point. What spiritual being are we talking about? By the characteristics of creation itself. Now, it's okay, capital G, God, I think that's generically a good direction. But there's more happening there than I think most of our English translations are able to communicate to us. So as the Bible, the story at least starts with this generic spiritual being, and then as it unfolds, it's becoming clearer and clearer. Oh, this must not be the God of the Canaanites. This is definitely not the God of the Babylonians. This is not the God of the Assyrians, because that doesn't line up with the stories that are told about those gods. So what spiritual being is this? And we start to get closer and closer, or deeper and deeper, in getting to know Yahweh. Okay, well, Elohim, who will be introduced as Yahweh. And where we actually have a very clear differentiation between some generic spiritual being and who this spiritual being is the story of Moses and the burning bush in Exodus chapter 3. So if you remember the story, by this point in time, the story has moved along to where promises made to Abraham, or Abram and Sarai, which this spiritual being called this family out of the beginnings of Babylon. You understand, Abraham was not a quote-unquote ethnic Jew, because there wasn't such thing yet. So he calls them out of ancient Babylon, and will, through his presence, through that relationship, make promises to Abraham, 4 in total. I'll make you great. I'm going to be your God, and you're going to be great because of that. So that's number 1. You're going to have this whole nation come from you. Number 2. Number 3, they're going to have their own land. You're going to stop being a Bedouin tribe. You're going to have a land. You're going to be established. And number 4, one of your descendants will be a blessing to all nations. The rest of the story is unfolding those promises. The family eventually, 70 in all, moved to Egypt. There was a famine going on. Joseph was sold into slavery, if you remember that story. Very dysfunctional family. Next time you feel bad about your own, go read some of the families in the Bible. Hugely dysfunctional. So the family eventually moves to Egypt because Joseph reveals himself. God works out some powerful things. They're going to get actually a really nice plot of land. And you're thinking, maybe this is it, right? We're going to have a land. Maybe this is it. Pharaoh's good, likes Joseph. So his family gets special treatment. But then there arose a Pharaoh that did not know Joseph, and that's because a slight little important fact is implied. 300 years have gone by. That's why there's a Pharaoh who didn't care about who Joseph was. So then the people are enslaved, and then what seems to be a good thing, right? They have their own land. They seem like they're making finding their way. They're now enslaved and oppressed by the gods of Egypt. And so God's going to interact. Yahweh's going to interact with that. Going to pull them all out as we know the story. But to get that to happen, God shows up to Moses at the burning bush. And here's where we pick up verse 13. There's a whole conversation there, verse 13 and 14. God talks to Moses and says, hey, good news. I heard the cry of my people. I'm going to do something. Moses is like, yeah. And it's going to be through you. And then Moses is like, oh, I'm kind of busy that day. And so he starts to come up with a bunch of excuses. God gets a little annoyed. And one of the excuses is, you want me to just show up and be like, a spiritual being sent me? They're going to be like, what spiritual being? And so here's the conversation. So Moses said to Elohim, so Elohim, God, spiritual being, suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, the Elohim, the spiritual being of your fathers, have sent me to you. And they'll ask me, what is his name? Like, what God are you talking about? Then, what am I going to tell them? So Elohim, spiritual being, says to Moses, I am who I am. You're like, that's worse. Like, the I am who I am have sent me. What God is that? Right? This is what you're to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. Well, Moses is perplexed because I don't know if that adds clarity. The actual the words there that's translated I am who I am is right? Which literally means I will be that I will be. The I will be that I will be has sent me to you. We're like, is Moses having a stroke? Because his language doesn't even line up right. Like, what is he saying? So God then says, actually, here's what you tell. Then we pick up in verse 15. So Elohim, once again, generic word for spiritual being, also said to Moses, say then to the Israelites, the Yahweh, the God of your fathers. So Yahweh, the spiritual being of your fathers, the spiritual being of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. I keep repeating that. I want you to understand what's used in that word, capital G, God, has sent me to you. This is my name forever. The name you shall call me from generation to generation. And the name is not God. It's Yahweh. You're like, okay, that's a little more coherent than, I am who I am, or I will be that I will be, which God was making a point there, that I am who I am and I will be who I will be because I've always have been, I am, and I will be. Like, there's no beginning to God. There's no, which most Christian stories had some beginning to their gods. Like the God of the Babylonians, self-spawned. Right? He starts kind of in this egg cocoon looking thing and this primordial embiotic fluid of the cosmos, and then he just spawns. How about this God? He just has always been. He just is. So he's trying to make a point about his nature, but the name really is Yahweh. Yahweh. What does Yahweh mean? And if you're thinking Lord, hold that thought. So, Yahweh, and normally, actually, it doesn't have vowels, but in English, we put vowels there so it can sound like something. Otherwise, it's Yahweh. It's actually the ancient form of the Hebrew verb for he will be. So the and Yahweh actually overlap in what God is trying to say. So I am, I will always be, and I have been, and I will continue to be. And my name really is, I will be what I have already been. It's because I am. So that's kind of a long name, so let's just go with Yahweh. Yahweh actually does not mean Lord, as we most often associate it. But here's why we often associate it with it. So the name of God appears, Yahweh appears over 6,500 times in the Bible. It actually, once again, it's to be his name. We just use God. But over the centuries, the Israelites, wanting to honor that name, they were actually apprehensive and afraid to even say it out loud or even write it. Because it was that holy, that separate, that unique. And now today we put the word God with cuss words. They were just freaked out to even say it out loud. And so every time they came to the word Yahweh, and you understand, manuscripts were hand copied, right? So every time the scribe is copying and it gets to Yahweh, he was afraid to even write it out. So instead, they would write the word Adonai, which means Lord, which in some of your English translations is translated all capitals, Lord, which is different from the word, the generic word for Lord, which is the word Adon, which could then be like Lord, my king, or Lord, my master, or Lord, a shepherd that's lording over the sheep. So there's that generic word, but then there's Adonai, which would be like, in English, the best way we can do it is capitalize it. It is a unique Lord. So we have in English associated Yahweh with Lord, but it really doesn't mean that. They just stopped writing Yahweh to put Adonai because they were just trying to be reverent. Does this make sense? We all lined up? So I don't know, maybe we should call God Yahweh. Seems to be his preferred name. And not even think about that as Lord, because it's really doesn't really mean that. It just means he will be what he already is, because he continues to be the I am that was. Right? So just Yahweh. Thoughts? How we feeling?
When people cuss God, are they using Elohim or are they using Yahweh?
Well, if they're using the English word God, G-O-D, I think they're not using Yahweh. So maybe that's why they don't burst in flames. Probably don't come up with a cuss word that includes Yahweh, so who knows what will happen then.
Okay, Mel.
Yeah.
Just something struck me. Then that 300 years post Joseph, and in Exodus it talks about how God heard the nation crying out, but when he introduces himself, he needs a name, and it's this kind of somewhat difficult name to share. Do you think the Hebrew nation that had grown had really lost sight of the God of Abraham, and maybe more, and continued to struggle with the Egyptian gods even after the Exodus, because we don't have a covenant that's formalized that tells them how to behave around
until the other side of Moses. Yeah.
So do you think they'd become somewhat heathenistic?
I think the stories were passed on, just kind of stories, right? So one generation passing it on to the other, and I think at best, I think it was at least diluted, or like, our ancestors Abraham. Here's how we ended up here, and we have our God, but here's the other gods, because they're obviously so ingrained with Egypt that Moses goes up to the mountain for 40 days, and they're like, well, he's dead. Let's have our own God, right? So we just go with a God from Egypt. And so, they were definitely, I think sometimes we think of like, Abraham was a Christian, and Moses followed. I mean, it's more complex than that. Yeah, I think there was, so I think the 10 plagues, or the little translation is the 10 strikes. The 10 strikes were Lord Yahweh in a world of gods making the point that I am Yahweh, I am Lord, I am powerful. And so he's introducing himself to the Egyptians, he's reintroducing himself to the Israelites, and he's already warning the other nations that the Israelites are eventually going to interact with. This is the kind of God I am. And that actually plays into our next point in Exodus chapter 5, 1 and 2. So by this time, Moses says, fine. So he goes to Pharaoh, and this is the first interaction he's having with Pharaoh after that 40 years of him in the wilderness. So after Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, this is what Yahweh, the Elohim of Israel. So Pharaoh would have been fine with the slaves having their God, because everybody had a God. Now, it must not be an impressive God, because look who's in charge. We are. And so, but here it's already, there's a name to this God, and he's Yahweh. Let my people go so that they may hold a festival to me in the wilderness. And Pharaoh said, and this is important, who is this Yahweh that I should let the people go? I don't know this Yahweh. And really, don't care. And so that's what the 10 plagues are about, is you want to know who this Yahweh is? Well, you're about to find out. It's like you poked a tiger with a short stick. Now you're going to regret that it was a short stick, right? Because you're really going to get to find out who Yahweh is. And the 10 plagues are, every single one of them is a strike against one or more gods of Egypt. I think we often kind of miss some of that because we're not Egyptians, and didn't grow up in that world. But it's a direct attack to the gods of Egypt to show that Yahweh is indeed not just one more spiritual being. He is the Lord. So Moses then says, and this is interesting, talking about what did Abraham know? And then what did the descendants of Abraham know? So in Exodus chapter 6, now we're getting like the whole Mount Sinai covenant. Then Yahweh said to Moses, now you will see what I will do to Pharaoh. Because of my mighty hand, he will let them go. Because of my mighty hand, he will drive them out of his country. So then generic Elohim also said to Moses, I am Yahweh. I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob as spiritual being Almighty, or El Shaddai. But my name, the Yahweh, I did not make myself fully known to them. I also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan where they reside as foreigners. Moreover, I have heard the groaning of the Israelites whom the Egyptians are enslaving, and I have remembered my covenant. So it's like Abraham knew me in part by a characteristic of mine, my power, my almightiness. But he really didn't know me as Yahweh. It'd be like saying, my students know me as Professor Mel. Some call me Dr. Latorre, which is fine. You know. I'm not, but neither is Dr. Pepper, and Queen Latifah is not a queen, so I might as well be Dr. Latorre. So, yeah, but they don't know me as, you know, just Mel or like my kid's dad, or, you know, so there's layers of what, and that's part of the story. Like, God introduces himself in Genesis with the most generic word. And I think then the further you go into the story, the closer and deeper and more intimately you know God, all the way unto Jesus, who is the most intimate expression of God. Then we get to know him relationally, not just a name, relationally, as a human who would cry and sit and teach and, you know, interact and hug. So God has been introducing himself slowly, more intimately as the story progresses. So Abraham knew God in part. Moses gets to know God more closely, even it says face to face, which not sure what all that means, except that it's probably more unique than everybody else was interacting with him, even though he really just got to see the back end of God as God hit him in a rock, you know, like put your face over there because I'm going to pass by, and that's as much as you can handle. Yet somehow that was already more intimate than other interactions up to then. So there is this. El Shaddai isn't another name for God. I think it's a characteristic of God. It's an emphasis of God. I think his name is Yahweh. He is powerful. He is mighty. He is Lord. He is King. He is which God? Yahweh. Thoughts so far? And what is this God about, right? What is Yahweh about? What does it mean that Yahweh is our God? Well, in Exodus chapter 6, therefore say to the Israelites, I am Yahweh, and I will bring you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. I will free you from being slaves to them, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with the mighty acts of judgment, which is those 10 plagues, the 10 strikes. So an outstretched arm, I think the imagery is God is flexing. You really want to mess with me? And then he's like, you know, kind of the kind of thing. And the other gods should be afraid. The other nations should be afraid. Because they have their gods, real or imagined, that are going to protect them. But look at our God flexing. Right? It'd be like, I go to the gym there at OC, and, there's a particular time there with a particular one of the guys' clubs that come to work out together, and they're all flexy and stuff, and all that stuff. It would be like, do you know my buddy Arnold? Back in the day when Arnold was the Terminator, and he comes in there and just flexes, and then all those guys are like, and they go cry to their mama, because their muscles aren't that impressive. And that's what Yahweh is saying. Watch me flex, and I'm then going to act powerfully. See what I'm going to do with a smackdown with the gods of Egypt. And he smacks them all. 10 strikes. Like he wins. And so the most oppressed people have the strongest God. And Pharaoh made a mistake in assuming that temporary time of oppression meant the God of Israel was a weak God. And that's not what it meant at all. And this God is a God of power, is a God of freedom. He's a God of liberation. He's a God that doesn't put up with injustice, or not very long. He's a God that notices and will rise up against, the oppressors. And is a God that keeps his promise. Now, to you and I, we're like, oh yeah, that's cool, that's great. But this was a world of gods where most of the gods in the stories of creation and all this, those gods were like petty, cruel, vindictive, cheaters, like moody. Some of them might have had some psychological disorders. They would sleep with women and they would kill other gods. I mean, it's just a horrible mess. And to have a God that makes a promise, keeps the promise, and he is about justice, that was quite unique. It was very different. And he's a God that can back it up, right? He doesn't have to get a bunch of gods together so they can fight the other gods. If you watch the Greeks and the pantheon, and it's a horrible mess, and they would get together to fight other gods to see who's going to win, and even Zeus and cheating on, it's just a mess, But not so with Yahweh. Deuteronomy 6, 1 and 2, these are the commands, decrees, and laws. This is when they're setting up the covenant. Yahweh, your Elohim, right? I am who I am, your spiritual being, directed me to teach you to observe in the land that you are crossing the Jordan to possess. Here's why. Here's why you should stay on board with this covenant. So that you, your children, and their children, so that your generations that will come will fear Yahweh, your spiritual being, as long as you live, by keeping all his decrees and command that I give you, and so that you may enjoy long life. When you have Yahweh as your protector, it's going to go well. Until you stop having Yahweh as your protector. And then it's not. And then you're going to welcome to the mess. Right? We're power playing and my people against your people, and we just go from there. History is brutal. I don't know if you do much of history. I mean, I guess you can just watch the news for a little bit. But in the 15th century, there was a guy named Vlad the Impaler. What do you think he was known for? He impaled, I want to say, tens of thousands of his enemies. That's where the stories of Dracula eventually become. How do you kill Dracula? With a stake, right? It's like you're turning the irony as you're going to kill Vlad the Impaler with impaling him. And so, brutal. The Assyrians perfected the art of skinning the enemies alive and keeping them alive until you could impale them and they just swarm around till they eventually die. Don't you want Yahweh to protect you? It's a rough neighborhood. You really should have Yahweh on your side. But Israel didn't always do that, right? But to help them remember the importance of keeping Yahweh as their God, they were to recite the Shema, which literally means to hear. And it starts with, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, and the Lord is one. The Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength." And the Jews have been repeating that as a prayer, a collective, individual and collective prayer for a good portion of the last, couple thousand years. They were supposed to be, and that was supposed to remind them of, we want Yahweh, because he is our spiritual being. In a world of other options, this is who you want. And so the Shema, they still say it today, and might be good for us to say it too. I think it's just a good reminder. Because it literally means hear. I'm supposed to hear what I'm saying. And so I say it. So it's the Shema. How are we feeling? Thoughts? All right, let's put this in perspective with Jesus, because it gets pretty cool. So, all right, first in Deuteronomy chapter 18, there's Moses. This is kind of where he's like passing the baton on. Joshua, Yeshua, which means the Lord saves, which is a variation of the name Jesus, which means the Lord saves. So he's going to take the people into the promised land, which is what Jesus comes to do, right? To take us into the spiritual promised land. Before that, Moses is saying, one of these days, well, let's just read the verse in Acts, because Peter quotes Moses. For Moses said, and here's the quote, Yahweh your Elohim will raise up for you a prophet like me from among your own. You must listen to everything he tells you. Anyone who does not listen to him will be completely cut off from his people. And Peter says, that's Jesus. Jesus is the new Moses. If you read Matthew with all the cool nuances that Matthew does, Matthew is comparing and contrasting without even saying the name Moses, that Jesus is the new Moses. In a lot of cool ways. One is Jesus feeds, Jesus spends the whole temptation of Jesus, 40 days in the wilderness, and then he's going to be tempted and tested. And then that's a whole parallel with the story of Moses, Israel in the wilderness, how they failed the test, thus they have to die off 40 years in the wilderness, eating bread from heaven. Jesus says, one does not live by bread alone, but by the word of God, which is what Israel should have listened to. I am your God. We will go into that nation, of that land, and we will conquer it. They didn't trust that. So then for 40 years, they had to eat bread that was like, what is this? Which is literally what manna means. What? That's what it means. What's this? What? Exactly. Manna. 40 years they had to learn to trust God, to trust the word of God. So there's that comparison. Jesus, Matthew 5, 6, and 7, Jesus is up on a mount talking about representing the voice of God. Moses goes up to the mount to get the commands of God. He comes down from the mount with 10 commandments. Jesus comes down from the mount in Matthew 8 and 9 and has 10 stories of healing. Like, it's really cool. When Jesus feeds the 5,000, it's also connecting with Moses who fed the people. Then Jesus has another feeding story, which isn't two feeding stories of randomness. The first is to Jews. The second is to non-Jews. So he's going to be the new Moses to all people. It's really cool. And off we go. So it's Jesus is the new Moses, and Peter just says it flat out in this sermon. We normally just go to Acts 2:38, get baptized. But it's quite a brilliant sermon. And part of the sermon is just that. Jesus is the new Moses. Why is that relevant? John chapter 5. Jesus is having this very long conversation with the religious leaders that were meant to be the representatives of God. Right? They were supposed to be the voice of God unto the people, or at least the representatives. But that conversation doesn't go well. It takes a turn. They're challenging Jesus. And they're challenging Jesus by what authority? Who said you could say these things? You claim to speak on behalf of God, but you're a peasant. We at least have a degree, right? And we look at what we wear, and so we must know what we're saying. And I work at the temple, and what do you do again? Like, who are you? And Jesus goes back and forth, and as the conversation progresses, they get more and more intense towards Jesus. Jesus eventually says that their father's the devil. So, I mean, it really takes a turn for worse. But in that conversation, here's Jesus, chapter 5, verse 45 to 47. But do you not think I will accuse you before the Father? But do not think I will accuse you before the Father. In other words, I don't even have to say negative things about you, even though your dad's the devil. But because your accuser is actually going to be Moses, on whom you hopes are set. You claim that I do not represent God because Moses represented God. Now, you already know that Peter says Jesus is the new Moses. Matthew makes this brilliant point that Jesus is the new Moses. And the readers are already like, but isn't Jesus the new Moses? But they're making the point that they're listening to Moses and not this peasant Jesus. But if you actually believed in Moses, you would believe in me, for he wrote about me. But since you do not believe what he wrote, how are you willing to believe what I say? Right? I am the new Moses, and you won't listen. Even if you listen to the original Moses, Moses was actually leading the people towards who I am. And it gets even more tricky when we get to John chapter 8, and here's where he talks about the father's the devil and so forth. Jesus says this, very truly I tell you, Jesus answered, before Abraham was born, I am. What do you think Jesus is saying? Who's this I am? Right? It's Yeh. It is Yahweh. He's not just saying God and I are close friends, or even the idea of like God and I have a special relationship. He is saying, I am Yahweh. Yeah, that's blasphemous. That's going to get you in a world of trouble, and it almost did. Well, it eventually did. But at this very point, they pick up stones to stone him. But Jesus himself hid, slipping away from the temple grounds. Why were they going to kill him with stones? Because he said, not only is he willing to say basically the idea of Yahweh, he then goes further to say, that's me. That's me. So it's very intense what Jesus is saying. He's not just saying I'm a prophet like Moses, I'm another prophet, I'm the better prophet. He's saying I am Yahweh. And then, interesting enough, 7 different times, Jesus uses the statement, I am. In English, it just gets like, it's just a good sentence, right? I am this or that or the other. How other way would you say it? What he's saying is basically, as Yahweh, I am Yahweh in a lot of different expressions. I am Yahweh as the bread of light. Or the bread of life. I am the light. I am the door. I'm the good shepherd. I'm the resurrection. I'm the way. I'm the truth. I'm the life. Every time it's that I am, he is alluding to I am Yahweh. I am who I am because I will be. Like that whole thing, that's what he's saying. So very intense. That's why he doesn't say, I came to bring a better truth or even to complete the truth. As the I am the truth. Like he is and always has been and will continue to be Yahweh. Is this making sense? It's quite intense. Yeah, that gets you killed. Oh, it did. They were going to do it right then. And today we're so chummy with God, which part of it is okay and good because Jesus did want us to be more intimate with Yahweh. That's why he came, to like interact. I'm not just sending a message. I am the truth. Like he comes. So he wants us to be more intimately know Yahweh. But we've made that so cozy and so casual that I don't think we get the intensity of how the religious leaders feel offended. They wouldn't even dare say Yahweh. Here's a peasant saying he is Yahweh. So, what's the relevance of all that to us? Why is that significant? Yes, that's one important thing. We need to have more reverence, and not. We need to have more reverence while really emphasizing how cool it is that we can be intimate with God. We need to revere more that instead of so casual about it. What else?
Maybe a little more circumspect in how we live our lives.
Yeah. How cool it is, and how awesome it is that what we know of Yahweh is so much more than basically a lot of the heroes of faith. Abraham knew God in part, and we get to know God so much more profoundly. Right? Yet we're probably so more casual with it. What else?
Sometimes we think of Jesus as our brother.
Mm-hmm.
And so really thinking about who we're saying is our brother.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's really that we've got to really think about that. Are we saying that Yahweh is a brother to us?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and not only that, when we call ourselves Christian, and we're going to talk about the word Christ later, but when we call ourselves Christian, it's quite a heavy word. Like it doesn't just mean Jesus. It means this whole Yahweh has come to allow us to bear his name. So it's much more profound. The I will be, for I will be, or that whole thing continues in us. We get to be bearers of that in one way or another. So I think we should be maybe more guarded and recognize the seriousness of carrying that name. Right? You didn't want to throw the name Yahweh around quite casually back then. And I think we have tainted the word Christian in a lot of circles.
Could we be a little more careful the next time the hammer mishits the nail?
Yes, that's right. Definitely don't use Yahweh in that sentence, right? Just to be sure. Worst case scenario, you can say, I meant God in the most generic sense of the word. Right? Yeah, and I don't know, maybe we would be more accurately in saying Yahweh instead of saying just capital G God. Because that's the most generic term for Yahweh. It'd be like my children calling me a parenting figure. Accurate, but the most generic way of saying it. Oh yes, parenting figure, one thing, maybe we should just say Yahweh. And remember, Yahweh and Lord don't really mean the same thing. They've just been interchangeably used by the Jews over the centuries out of respect for the word Yahweh. Adonai means Lord, or Adon, the most generic version of it. Right, next class, we're going to talk about the serpent. It'd be cool. And then after that, we're going to talk about hell. I mean, might as well, right? We can put those two together. And so, don't miss those two, right? All right, well, thanks for being here. Go ye and reflect Yahweh.